3 centuries ago, a new people arrived in Thedas from across the northern sea. They overran the island of Parvolan first, landing in huge ships armed with cannons, horned giants covered in armor and paint, espousing an alien philosophy. These were the Qunari. With vast numbers and unprecedented firepower, the Qunari swept across the north of Thedas. The Tevinter Imperium and the Orlesian Empire, ancient enemies, were forced to put aside their differences to push the Qunari back from the mainland. After over 150 years of intermittent warfare, a peace treaty was signed, but the Qunari only viewed this as an opportunity to pull back and rebuild their strength. They still viewed the lands of Thedas as theirs to conquer and enlighten. Today we shall explore the history, society, and ideology of the Qunari. The Qunari trace the foundation of their philosophy to a man they call Kozlun, likely originating from some region far to the north of Thedas. They give him the title Ashkaari, which means one who seeks. It is a title often used for philosophers or scientists. His writings form the basis for the Qun. This is an excerpt from the Qun describing Kozlun's revelation. Long ago, the Ashkaari lived in a great city by the sea. Wealth and prosperity shone upon the city like sunlight, and still its people grumbled in discontent. The Ashkaari walked the streets of his home and saw that all around him were the signs of genius, triumphs of architecture, artistic masterpieces, the palaces of wealthy merchants, libraries, and concert halls. But he also saw signs of misery, the poor, sick, lost, frightened, and the hopeless. And the Ashkaari asked himself, how can one people be both wise and ignorant, great and ruined, triumphant and despairing? So the Ashkaari left the land of his birth, seeking out other cities and nations, looking for a people who had found wisdom enough to end hopelessness and despair. He wandered for many years through empires filled with palaces and gardens, but in every nation of the wise, the great, and the mighty, he found the forgotten, the abandoned, and the poor. Finally, he came to a vast desert, a wasteland of bare rock clawing at the empty sky, where he took shelter in the shadow of a towering rock, and resolved to meditate until he found his answer or perished. Many days passed, until one night, as he gazed out from the shadow of the rocks, he saw the lifeless desert awaken. 100,000 locusts hatched from the barren ground, and as one they turned south, a single wave of moving earth. The Ashkaari rose and followed in their wake, a path of devastation miles wide. The once verdant land turned to waste, and the Ashkaari's eyes were opened. Existence is a choice. There is no chaos in the world, only complexity. Knowledge of the complex is wisdom. From wisdom of the world comes wisdom of the self. Mastery of the self is mastery of the world. Loss of the self is the source of suffering. Suffering is a choice, and we can refuse it. It is in our own power to create the world or destroy it. And the Ashkaari went to his people. The Qunari describe this revelation with an oft-repeated phrase, Asit Taleb, it is to be. Everything and everyone has a nature. In following that nature, all things form a proper order in a complex whole. Struggling against that nature means fighting against themselves and against the world. That struggle only harms oneself and thus harms the world, causing suffering. The Qunari believe that understanding one's place in the order of the world and thus mastering the self is a way to eliminate suffering in the world and for oneself. They like to say that existence is the only real choice one has, by which they mean the choice to exist in harmony with one's nature and place. A fuller explanation and dissection of the Qunari philosophy will probably be worth another video on its own. In practice, the Qunari have developed their philosophy into a system that dominates every aspect of life from birth. As society is part of an orderly world, each individual must have a role in society according to their nature. If they find and fulfill this role, they will be free of suffering, and if all do so, then society will be free of suffering. Thus, priests of the Qun raise every child and observe them to determine what role they should fill. The parents of those children are paired by the priests for their traits. According to their assigned roles, each individual serves the greater whole of Qunari society. As they spread the Qun through the world, the Qunari view it as bringing purpose to the purposeless. By creating a society where every person serves the greater whole, they bring the world to order and an end to suffering. Now, before we go any further, we have to be specific with our terminology, because this is the source of some confusion. Qunari is a confusing term because non-Qunari frequently use it as a colloquial term for the race of large horned beings that arrived in Thedas 300 years ago. The Dragon Age fanbase, along with the developers themselves, also use the word this way just to keep things confusing. What the term actually means, however, is people of the Qun, the Qun being the religious philosophy that defines the Qunari. The horned giants, however, did not always follow the Qun, and some do not even in modern Thedas, so they are technically not Qunari. In addition, humans, elves, and possibly dwarves have also joined the Qunari since they arrived, so there are horned giants that are not Qunari, and Qunari that are not horned giants. Let's lay out some terms then. One you may hear is Kossith. This term is used to refer to the pre-Qun civilization or culture that the horned giants were part of. We know virtually nothing about the Kossith, or even if the term referred to their race exactly. It is used in a strictly historical context, and modern members of the race, or the Qun, do not use it in reference to themselves. Only some scholars and the Qunari priesthood are even aware of it for the most part. The next term is Vashoth, which means Grey Ones. The Qunari use this term to refer to those horned giants that are born outside of Qunari society. This often means the descendants of those that abandoned the Qunari in the centuries since they arrived in Thedas. Be sure not to confuse this with the next term. You may have heard Tal-Vashoth, which means true Grey Ones. This term is used by the Qunari as a label for those that have abandoned or rebelled against the Qunari. I will explore them a bit later in this video. However, as any race can be a Qunari, any race can also be Tal-Vashoth. I'll repeat that Qunari is a follower of the Qun, and any race may be a follower of the Qun, though most followers of the Qun are the horned giants. When someone that was not born into the Qun converts, they are called Vidathari. Thus those humans, elves, and dwarves that are Qunari are generally Vidathari. In theory, a Vashoth that converted to the Qun would also be a Vidathari. Again, people colloquially use the term Qunari interchangeably with almost all of these, depending on context, so it can get confusing. We don't really have a term that only refers to the race, regardless of association with the Qun. though some fans use Vashoth like that. Let's move on to how the Qunari structure their civilization. The Qunari society is led by a triumvirate structure. The trio, called the Salazari, represents the body, mind, and soul of the Qunari people. The Arishok is the leader of the Antam, the military arm of the Qunari. The word Antam means body in the Qunari language, Qunlat. The Antam consists of the Qunari's many soldiers, and probably the most powerful navy in Thedas. It is also intended to be the primary means by which the Qunari as a people interact with the rest of the world, acting as a go-between for the mind and the soul. As the body encloses and protects the mind and the soul, so does the Antam protect the Qunari nation. The vanguard of the Antam are the Barasad, soldiers that travel beyond Qunari lands to gather information for the Arishok. As the body acts in accordance with the mind and soul, so is the Arishok only supposed to take action sanctioned by the Salazari. In the past, Arishok have been stripped of their role for taking action on their own initiative. When the Arishok attacked the city of Kirkwall in 934 Dragon, the other two members of the Salazari made an unprecedented trip to the city of Kantar in Ravane, where they denounced the Arishok's actions before diplomats and chantry officials as not representing a demand of the Qun, hoping to avoid sparking another war. A new Arishok was soon selected. The Arigena is charged with oversight of the mind of the Qunari, and thus oversees all agricultural, industrial, and mercantile concerns. All weapons and materials used by the forces of the Antam or the priesthood are created by the Arigena's craftsmen. All of the food is produced and distributed according to the Arigena's command. Last, but certainly not least, the soul of the Qunari is represented by the priesthood and their leader, the Ariqun. There are two branches of the priesthood we know of. The Tamazrans manage the Qunari's selective breeding program, deciding which Qunari will conceive children. The Qunari don't have a conception of family as the rest of Thedas considers it. A father's role in his child's life ends at conception. The mother's ends at birth. If two Qunari develop a romantic sexual relationship, it is viewed as deviant behavior requiring intervention. Once born, the closest thing to a name they get is basically a sequence of letters and numbers the Tamazrans use to track genealogical information. Qunari are referred to by their role, and whatever nicknames they develop among their peers. All children are raised and educated by the Tamazrans, who observe their development and assign their role when they reach the age of 12. As an aside, this applies to all races under the Qun, though the Tamazrans do not crossbreed different races. Tamazrans also provide counseling and rehabilitation to Qunari that need it, which includes providing sexual release if deemed necessary. They also care for Qunari that are mentally incapable or too physically impaired to function without help. The other branch of the priesthood is the Ben Hazrith, which means the heart of the many in Qunlat. They are the enforcement and conversion arm of the priesthood. The Ben Hazrith itself may be divided into three branches: dangerous questions, dangerous actions, and dangerous purpose. Dangerous Questions handles the majority of Qunari intelligence gathering, operating a spy network of undercover Qunari as well as converted elves and humans that extends throughout Thedas. Dangerous Actions is a pure enforcement branch that punishes violations of the Qun. They mostly remain in Qunari lands, save occasionally to hunt defectors. Dangerous Purpose has a large mandate that covers the conversion of foreigners, the re-education of Qunari dissidents, as well as collecting and quarantining all things magical. Essentially, this branch is charged with handling and neutralizing all things the Qunari regard as a potential or definite danger. It should be said that a Qunari's role in the Qun can change, often in the form of a promotion or demotion. For example, the elven convert known as Talus was given the role of Athlock, a laborer, following a disastrous failure in her mission as one of the Ben Hazrith. She was restored to her role when a need for her skills arose. In the other direction, the current Arishok was previously a soldier of the Barasad. Similarly, the successor of the Arakun is currently a Tamazrin designated as Rasan, which translates to chosen heir. It seems to be common, and it just makes sense, that the Qunari assign successors to roles of responsibility, so they may develop their skills and prove themselves before assigning them to high positions, rather than assigning such roles to children. I will elaborate on more specifics regarding Qunari beliefs. On a more individual level, the Qunari teach self-mastery through embodying their role. Qunari typically only go by their role in substitute of actual names. The rigid discipline and devotion to one's role prescribed by the Qun is necessary for an individual to tame their destructive tendencies. Otherwise, they suffer a loss of self. Many come to fear this loss of self so much that some Qunari become panicked to the point of temporary madness if they feel they've violated the Qun. As an example, for some Qunari, the tools they use to fulfill their role are considered highly significant and carry the soul of the Qunari in question. Losing or casting aside such a tool is tantamount to abandoning the Qun. One wounded member of the Barasad became so distressed when he discovered his weapon was missing that he lashed out and killed the family of farmers that had nursed him back to health. I should also elaborate on the Qunari attitude towards gender roles. The Qunari believe that men and women have different innate traits that suit them to different roles. For example, the Qunari generally believe that women have better management skills than men, so the Arigena is always a woman. So too for nurturing roles like the Tamazrin. No matter how skilled a man may be in these areas, he will always be seen as inferior to a woman in those roles. Instead, he will be assigned to another role the Tamazrins decide he has an aptitude for. The same holds for women. No matter how talented a fighter she may be, for example, a woman will always be viewed as less suited to the role of a warrior than a man. In general, soldiery is considered a male role, and thus the Antam is almost exclusively male. The production of food and other industries is very female-dominated due to Qunari views on administrative and managerial tasks. The priesthood tends to be more mixed, with both male and female roles, though their specialties are separate. For example, re-education and conversion of men falls to male members of the Ben Hazrith, while re-education of women and children falls to female members. Also, while women cannot be warriors, they can have roles that involve fighting. Many agents of the Ben Hazrith are just such women. As their role is perceived as more cerebral than being a soldier, it isn't viewed as a warrior role. It is important to mention that there are rare exceptions to these things. A male Qunari will farm and a female will fight if the situation calls for it. The Qunari also recognize something called Akun Athlock, someone born as one gender but living as another. If a woman is extremely well suited to being a warrior, she may be considered male and live as a man in that role, for example. I'll emphasize that it isn't really a matter of individual feelings or preference, more what the Qunari priests believe they're suited to. Moving on to how the Qunari view outsiders, most Qunari find other societies utterly strange and nonsensical compared to the order of the Qun. Other nations are inferiors, referred to as Kabathari, those who must be taught. Individuals are referred to as Bas, which means thing. Bas are unfortunates in need of enlightenment, so they may be brought to proper existence, a proper role in the world. Occasionally, an outsider will manage to impress a Qunari and earn recognition as Basalit An, a Bas worthy of respect who would benefit greatly from the wisdom of the Qun. A Basalit An is still only a worthy foe, however, as the Qunari believe strongly that the spread of the Qun is inevitable. Cooperation with Bas is temporary, and the Qunari fully intend to complete the conquest they began when they first arrived in Thedas centuries ago. When the Qunari conquer a place, they break up families first. Children are taken by the Tamazrans to be raised according to the Qun. Adults are sent to labor or learning camps run by the Ben Hazrith for re-education. The Qunari do not view themselves as coercing people to the Qun, as the Qun can only be chosen, though it's hard to describe their conversion process in any other way. They will essentially isolate them and reason with them, attempting to bring them to the desired conclusion that the Qun will bring them purpose and meaning they lack in life. Those who resist even this are taken to temples or facilities called Vidathlok. Supposedly, these are healing facilities, though what exactly goes on there is unknown. Some appear later having been given a substance called Kamek, which destroys their minds and reduces them to near mindless thralls. They do menial tasks and are often sent to perform hard labor in mines and construction. The Qunari do accept willing converts, many of which can be found in the northern city of Kantar in Ravane. It is the only place in Thedas where you'll find Qunari actively and peacefully proselytizing their philosophy to outsiders. The converted, Vidathari, are treated no different than those born into the Qun. In theory, one could ascend to the Salisari if found suitable, though this isn't terribly likely. To close out this section, I want to mention Qunari beliefs about dragons. Their word for dragons is Atashi, or glorious ones. Dragons are embodiments of savage power, pure in their own way, and as such sacred to the Qunari as much as they hold anything sacred. This does not mean they hesitate to kill dragons, however. Like any danger to civilization, they must be slain if they are a threat. It is forbidden to show actual reverence for dragons. The horned giants do have some physical resemblance to dragons, their horns resembling some dragon's horns, for example, which has led to some theories among the Ben Hazrith that the Tamazrans worked dragon blood into their lineage somehow, whether through drinking it or some ritual. Alternatively, this may have happened in whatever society the Qunari originally came from before the spread of the Qun. To that end, there are Qunari born without these physical traits. There are Qunari born without horns and skin tones more natural to other races, though they are just as large as any other of their kind. Interestingly, these rare hornless Qunari are viewed as special and thought to have a significant destiny. They are often given prestigious roles in Qunari society. That the Qunari value hornlessness suggests to me that maybe these draconic traits predate the Qun, and perhaps the Tamazrans are attempting to selectively breed them out. It's been insinuated that the horned giants may have an inherent violent side, similar to warriors that drink dragon blood called reavers, but that is little more than speculation. When the Qunari arrived in Thedas, they brought with them new technologies and substances that nobody had ever seen before. Most famous among these is an explosive powder the Qunari call Gatlock. Explosives exist in Thedas based on a magical material called lyrium, but there are various problems that make it difficult to work with and acquire much of. Gatlock isn't magical at all and much safer to handle, though its formulation is a closely guarded secret. Some variant of it can apparently be produced using venom extracted from a dragon as its core ingredient, but that may not be the normal process. Monopoly over Gatlock is central to Qunari military power, as Qunari ships are armed with cannons, making them at least a match for mage-defended ships from Thedas. The dreadnoughts, massive Qunari vessels described as floating fortresses, bristle with such weapons and are one of the most feared sights on the waters of Thedas. There are a few other interesting materials unique to them. I've already mentioned Kamek, a substance the Qunari use on hopeless cases, those who refuse to submit to the demands of the Qun. Kamek reduces them to mind-broken thralls, capable only of menial tasks and simple physical labor. There is another, possibly related substance called Sarkamek. It is a poison, but before it kills a person, it first sends them into a frenzied, violent state. They have an antidote that negates the effects if it is taken preemptively. There is also a substance called Vitar that Qunari warriors frequently wear on their skin as a sort of war paint. It has a few interesting qualities. For starters, it is highly toxic to any race that is not Qunari, here referring to the Horned Giants, regardless of affiliation with the Qun. It also has a unique interaction with their skin once applied, becoming extremely hard while retaining flexibility. Thus, even when seemingly wearing little armor, Qunari fighters are surprisingly well protected. One area where the Qunari distinctly lag behind the other civilizations of Thedas is magic. The Qunari view the Fade, the realm of dreams and spirits, as the land of the dead where their souls will go when they die. By the way, they attach no significance to bodies once a person has died, and will simply dispose of them as convenient, though the tools a Qunari use to fulfill their role in life are treated with reverence and painstakingly collected after death. The Qunari claim not to dream as the rest of Thedas does, for to enter the Fade while still alive is forbidden. Mages, those who can consciously enter the Fade, are thus objects of extreme caution. The Qunari word for mage is Sarabas, which means dangerous thing. All mages carry with them the risk of being possessed by the demons and spirits of the Fade. To the Qunari, for whom mastery of the self is central to their philosophy, to have oneself subverted by the will of demons is uniquely abhorrent. A Sarabas is always viewed as one that may be corrupted by that influence, and potentially spread it to others. Thus, Qunari treatment of their mages is so severe even most Chantry Templars would call it cruel. Their mouths are sewn shut, they are forced to wear chains and bulky collars, their faces covered by masks. In extreme cases, their tongues are cut out. Sarabas are closely monitored and are killed if they are ever separated from their minders for fear of corruption. The Qunari view the Sarabas with pity and the way they must live as a virtuous sacrifice for the good of all. The Sarabas themselves are deeply indoctrinated to this way of thinking. One such Sarabas chose to burn himself alive after being separated from his minders. When the Qunari arrived in Thedas, they did not use the Sarabas for anything. That changed after the Qunari armies struggled against the mages of Thedas. Eventually, the Antam began to very cautiously deploy their Sarabas as weapons on the battlefield. Sarabas are grouped together in a Karatam, a group of mages on the same leash, and led by a minder called an Arvarad, a title that means holds back evil. The Arvarad accompanies and regulates the Sarabas under their charge at all times, using a special device to keep them in line. In terms of the magic they use, Sarabas act exclusively as engines of destruction. They have no refined tradition of spellcraft or really much training whatsoever. Their uses of magic mostly consist of throwing as much raw power at their enemies as possible in the form of fire, ice, or other effects. This has led to a bit of a myth that Sarabas are uniquely powerful among the mages of Thedas, but this is not the case. Sarabas are no more inherently powerful than other mages. It's just that the only way they really know how to use that power is to lash out with as much of it as possible at any given time. According to writings recovered from the Ben Hazrith, they recently have begun using the Sarabas for another purpose. This change in policy came from the acquisition of knowledge of an elven mage long ago that once used magic to create the Veil, thus stripping his tyrannical rulers of their power. Thus the elf became an agent of peace and order by his actions. The Ben Hazrith began to consider that the power of the Sarabas might be used to strengthen the Veil and prevent the intrusion of demons and spirits. That is, if they can learn how. Now we'll be going over how the Qunari arrived in Thedas and the wars fought against them. The Qunari first arrived in Thedas from across the northern ocean, landing on the island of Pre-Veilguard in 630 Steel. Where they originally came from is the subject of much speculation. Rank-and-file Qunari in the modern day don't seem to think the subject is worth talking about, if they even know. Pre-Veilguard had native inhabitants and some outposts of the Tevinter Imperium, but overall the island was considered quite remote and had minimal contact with the mainland of Thedas. Most maps only show the southern edge of it. That's why nobody noticed right away when it quickly fell to Qunari conquest. They established themselves and constructed a new capital city called Qunari. The Qunari made themselves known to the rest of Thedas when they invaded the island of Saharan and northern Ravane 2 years later in 632 Steel. Within a decade, they had taken all of Saharan, most of Ravane, Antiva, and the Tevinter Imperium. In Tevinter, only the capital city of Minrathous still resisted them despite being besieged. The Qunari began to invade the Free Marches. All those successfully converted became new Qunari to support the war effort. These were just the opening battles of a period of intermittent warfare between the Qunari and the kingdoms of Thedas that would span 150 years. It was after this point that the kingdoms of Thedas finally got off the back foot, though conflict remained largely at an impasse for the next 43 years. By 685 Steel, human forces finally began pushing the Qunari out of Tevinter. By 723 Storm, some 35 years of bloodshed later, the Qunari had been pushed back to Saharan, eastern Tevinter, and northern Ravane. Even so, the forces of the human kingdoms were so hard-pressed to do even this much that rival religious leaders of Tevinter and the southern Chantry agreed to call joint exalted marches, crusades to push the Qunari from the continent and liberate the lands they had conquered. The first of these new exalted marches began in 725 Storm. It was quite successful, in no small part thanks to the efforts of the Circle of Magi in support of the Chantry forces, and the numerical advantage of the human kingdoms. But those converted to the Qun proved difficult to bring back to the teachings of the Andrastian Chantry. In the Tevinter city of Marnis Pel, Chantry forces resorted to purging Qunari converts by the sword and dumping their bodies in mass graves. The Chantry has denied these actions ever since. The Qunari still clung to the shores of Thedas some 27 years later, however, so another exalted march was called in 752 Storm. It was a complete disaster, with Qunari forces recapturing much of Antiva. Imperial and Orlesian Chantry forces did liberate the city of Treviso, but burned it to the ground in the process. The Qunari also captured the island of Estwatch in 754 Storm, which they used to launch attacks into the Waking Sea against Orlais, Navarra, and the Free Marches. A third and final exalted march was called just 3 years later, in 755 Storm, and this time the kingdoms would have help from an unexpected source. The raiders and pirate factions that controlled the island of Lomarin had come to consider the Qunari a greater threat to them than the navies of Thedas, so they united to form the Felicissima Armada. The Armada harried Qunari supply lines and did battle with the Qunari navy. Meanwhile, the Qunari launched an invasion of the Free Marches, aiming to take the cities of Starkhaven and Kirkwall. The location of both cities would help them prevent southern support from reaching the north, the former by land and the latter by sea. Starkhaven repelled them, but Kirkwall fell. This marks where the Qunari began to deploy their mages in battle. Sarabas tore down a section of the city wall, in a display of magic the likes of which had never been seen from the Qunari mages before. Orlesian forces managed to retake the city 4 years later in 760 Storm. The Qunari lost control of Estwatch in 778 Storm after a dramatic naval defeat at the hands of the Felicissima Armada, which took control of the island. By 784 Storm, the Qunari's only foothold on the mainland was the Ravani city of Kantar. By this point, the kingdoms of Thedas were exhausted, and much of the north was devastated by over a century of warfare. Assaults on Kantar had exacted a grievous toll on the population of the city, but failed to dislodge the Qunari defenders. Largely out of concern for the people of Kantar, the Qunari finally sued for peace, and the stretched thin human kingdoms accepted. Envoys met on the island of Lomarin and signed the Lomarin Accord. The Qunari agreed to withdraw from the mainland in return for their control of the northern islands being recognized. Thus there was peace, though it should be said that the treaty was immediately violated by both sides in the Kingdom of Ravane. First, though the Qunari military withdrew, the Ravani converts to the Qun refused to abandon their homes and go into exile in the islands. Second, when the Ravani Chantry purged many of these converts by the sword after they struggled to convert them back to Andrastian teachings. The Qunari did not take this as provocation to renew the war. In the time since, the Qunari have allowed some diplomatic exchanges with other peoples of Thedas, but they remain largely an alien cipher. The city of Qunendar is said to have splendid aqueducts, strange hive-like buildings, and architectural achievements to match the finest cities in Thedas, though almost nobody from the mainland has seen it, as very few outsiders are ever permitted to entry to Qunari lands. The Qunari themselves seem to view the peace as nothing but a pause while they develop a new approach and ultimately resume spreading the Qun to Thedas. There was one kingdom that abstained from the Lomarin Accord. The Tevinter Imperium refused to recognize Qunari control over the northern islands, which they had long claimed. Tevinter has remained at war with the Qunari for more than another 150 years. For the most part, this has taken the form of constant fighting over the island of Saharan, each controlling parts of it at various times. Since an invasion in 855 Blessed, the Qunari have controlled most of the island, with Tevinter only holding strips of the southern coast. The Qunari have also attempted to raid and invade the Tevinter mainland several times. In 912 Dragon, the Qunari launched a large-scale invasion of the Tevinter mainland that was foiled when the Tevinter mages rallied and counterattacked. All Qunari footholds were obliterated, and the fleet retreated to Saharan. Since 944 Dragon, the Qunari have been engaged in a new offensive against Tevinter, successfully capturing several cities in eastern Tevinter. In 945, the city of Naromenion fell. They have also been taking covert actions in Antiva, attacking its famous assassins guild, the Crows. This has led to fears that the Qunari are poised to break the Lomarin Accord and finally commence their long-awaited conquest. Something has been very off about the current offensive, however. Namely, it seems that the Arashok may be acting without the full support of the other leaders of the Qunari. Without proper support from the Ben Hazrith, how the Entam have handled conquered populations has been erratic. In Ventus, reports say that the Entam killed all the soldiers and forced Kamek on every mage they found, reducing them to mindless thralls. They left the women and children alone, but took the men to labor camps. In Naromenion, they seemingly killed adults on sight and took the children to be re-educated. And BioWare has released a short story as I was editing confirming that the Qunari have invaded and taken the city of Treviso in Antiva, which is a blatant violation of the Lomarin Accord. The actions of the Entam grow stranger still. That takes us to the present. Only time will tell what's really going on. We'll end with a brief discussion of those horned giants that are not of the Qun, starting with the Tal-Vashoth. The Tal-Vashoth, or True Grey Ones, are former Qunari that have abandoned the Qun. There are many reasons this may happen, from dissatisfaction with the role they've been assigned to, or simply growing tired of living a life entirely driven by duty. The Ben Hazrith will attempt to capture and re-educate Tal-Vashoth, or kill them on sight if they consider them a threat to the Qunari. Thus, any Tal-Vashoth must take on the life of a fugitive. Most Qunari view Tal-Vashoth as savage monsters that have abandoned order for chaos. Some do fit into this mold, violently attempting to rebel against the Qun and undermine the Qunari. As one Chantry priest glibly noted, even their rebels conform to expectations. Those eager to express their contempt for the Qun have also been known to cut off their horns. That generalization isn't really fair, though, as the choices they make are often decided by the skills they have. As they have the most contact with the outside world and thus the most opportunities to defect successfully, most Tal-Vashoth one will encounter are former warriors of the Entam. It isn't surprising many turn to banditry after leaving the Qunari. However, many also choose the more socially acceptable path of a mercenary. Entire mercenary bands of Tal-Vashoth can be found in the south. At least one Tal-Vashoth chose to become a merchant, however. While most of them are of the horned giants, as can be said of the Qunari in general, I should say that Tal-Vashoth can be of any race. Should any of those horned giant Tal-Vashoth pair off and have children, well, that's how most Vashoth come into the world. Vashoth, or Grey Ones, are horned giants born outside the Qun. They are generally more socially adjusted to the norms of human society, not having been raised in the Qun. They're pretty rare and often found in the same trades their parents practiced, mercenary work and such. Alright, that's it for now. If this all works out as I hope, I should have this ready for Dragon Age Day. If not, well, it is what it is. I hope you all have a good day.